are empires that fall in fire. There are empires that drown in blood. And then there are empires that do something far more terrifying than dying. They choose to erase themselves, not because they are weak, but because they are afraid. Afraid of memory, afraid of comparison, afraid that the past might one day rise up and challenge the present. This is not a story about collapse. This is a story about control. Imagine a world where history itself is illegal, where remembering the wrong sentence could cost you your life, where books are not sources of wisdom, but weapons of rebellion, where the past is not respected, but hunted. That world existed, and at its center stood an empire that believed unity could only survive if memory was destroyed. Welcome to the shadow of the Qin Dynasty. Before this empire existed, China was not China. It was fractured, bleeding, and exhausted. For more than 200 years, rival states fought endlessly in what history now calls the Warring States period. Entire generations were born into war and died in war. Cities burned, alliances shifted overnight, and loyalty meant nothing compared to survival. In this chaos, people did not dream of freedom. They dreamed of peace, at any cost. And that desperation created the perfect conditions for a man like Qin Shi Huang. He did not rise as a philosopher. He did not rule as a poet or a moral guide. He ruled as a machine of order, cold, calculated, and absolutely convinced that humanity could only be saved by absolute control. Where others saw tradition, he saw weakness. Where others saw history, he saw danger. To Qin Shi Huang, the past was not sacred. It was unstable. Every old story carried the seed of rebellion. Every ancient text whispered the idea that rulers could be judged, criticized, or replaced. Philosophies like Confucianism taught that a ruler's legitimacy depended on virtue, that leaders had moral obligations, that power could be questioned. For a man who had unified the world through force, this was unacceptable. So he asked a question no ruler had ever dared to ask so openly. What if the past itself is the enemy? The answer reshaped civilization. The order went out quietly at first, then loudly, then violently. Books that did not support the state ideology were collected. Philosophical texts, poetry, historical records, moral teachings, works passed down for centuries, were dragged into public squares and burned. Not symbolically, not selectively, systematically. Fire became policy. But fire alone was not enough. Because books do not remember themselves. People do. So scholars were targeted next. Intellectuals who resisted were arrested. Some were executed. Others were buried alive. A punishment so brutal that it echoed through generations as a warning. To think independently was no longer a virtue. It was a crime. Parents stopped teaching their children old stories. Teachers erased lessons from memory. Conversations became cautious, then silent. Knowledge retreated into whispers, and slowly an entire civilization learned to forget. This was not ignorance. This was enforced amnesia. At the same time, the Qin state standardized everything. Language, currency, measurements, laws, axle widths of carts. Even the way characters were written. Diversity was replaced with uniformity. Local identity dissolved into imperial identity. If people spoke the same words, measured the world the same way, and remembered the same approved stories, rebellion would become impossible. It was brilliant, and it was terrifying. Qin Shi Huang believed he was building eternity. He even obsessed over immortality, sending expeditions to find elixirs of life. He built a tomb guarded by thousands of terracotta soldiers, an army meant to protect him in the afterlife. A man so obsessed with control that he could not imagine a world without himself. But history is cruel to those who try to dominate it. The order went out quietly at first, then loudly, then violently. Books that did not support the state ideology were collected. Philosophical texts, poetry, historical records, moral teachings, works passed down for centuries, were dragged into public squares and burned. Not symbolically, not selectively, systematically. Fire became policy, but fire alone was not enough. Because books do not remember themselves. People do. So scholars were targeted next. Intellectuals who resisted were arrested. Some were executed. Others were buried alive. A punishment so brutal that it echoed through generations as a warning. To think independently was no longer a virtue. It was a crime. Parents stopped teaching their children old stories. Teachers erased lessons from memory. Conversations became cautious, then silent. Knowledge retreated into whispers. And slowly an entire civilization learned to forget. This was not ignorance. This was enforced amnesia. At the same time, the Qin state standardized everything. Language, currency, measurements, laws, axle widths of carts. Even the way characters were written. Diversity was replaced with uniformity. Local identity dissolved into imperial identity. If people spoke the same words, measured the world the same way, and remembered the same approved stories, rebellion would become impossible. It was brilliant, and it was terrifying. Qin Shi Huang believed he was building eternity. He even obsessed over immortality, sending expeditions to find elixirs of life. He built a tomb guarded by thousands of terracotta soldiers, an army meant to protect him in the afterlife. A man so obsessed with control that he could not imagine a world without himself. But history is cruel to those who try to dominate it. The empire he forged through fear lasted only 15 years. 15. The moment Qin Shi Huang died, the system began to rot from the inside. Fear without its architect collapses into chaos. Officials turned on each other. The people rebelled. The rigid structure cracked. And the dynasty fell with shocking speed. Yet here is the most haunting part of this story. When the next rulers tried to rebuild, they discovered something horrifying. The past was gone. The records destroyed. The philosophies silenced. The knowledge fragmented. Historians were forced to reconstruct entire centuries from rumors, second-hand accounts, and fragments preserved in secret. What survived did so by accident or by courage or by sheer luck. We do not know how much was lost. We never will. Entire schools of thought may have vanished forever. Scientific ideas, ethical systems, cultural narratives, all reduced to ash because one man believed unity required obedience, and obedience required forgetting. This is why the Qin Dynasty is different from every other empire in history. Rome left ruins. Egypt left monuments. Even defeated civilizations left stories told by their enemies. But the Qin tried to erase the very possibility of comparison, to make themselves not just rulers of the present, but gatekeepers of memory itself. And in doing so, they left behind something more powerful than monuments. A warning, because this story is not just ancient history, it is a mirror. Every time a state controls education, rewrites textbooks, suppresses dissenting narratives, or declares certain ideas dangerous, the ghost of the Qin Empire stirs. The question is not whether history can be erased. It can. The real question is, who decides what is remembered? Because once memory burns, truth follows. And once truth is gone, power becomes absolute. When the fires finally died down, something far more devastating than ash remained behind. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, unnatural silence that follows the destruction of something irreplaceable. The Qin Empire did not merely burn books, it burned entire ways of thinking. And unlike buildings or armies, ideas do not regenerate once they are gone. We often assume that ancient civilizations were primitive, that modern humanity naturally stands on a higher intellectual ground. But history tells a different story. Knowledge does not move in a straight line forward. It moves in cycles. It rises, it fractures, and sometimes it disappears completely. The Qin burnings created one of the largest intellectual black holes in human history. Before the rise of the Qin Dynasty, China was a living laboratory of ideas. Dozens of philosophical schools debated the nature of power, morality, society, law, warfare, human psychology, and even early forms of scientific observation. These were not casual thoughts. They were refined over generations, challenged, improved, and preserved through writing. Confucian scholars debated ethical leadership. Mahists explored logic, meritocracy, and early scientific reasoning. Legalists refined systems of governance. Naturalists studied patterns in nature that hinted at proto-scientific thinking. Military strategists analyzed human behavior with terrifying accuracy. Medicine, astronomy, agriculture, each field existed in early but powerful forms. Then came the order, burn it all. Entire libraries vanished overnight. Texts that had no surviving copies were erased permanently. Philosophical schools disappeared so completely that we only know their names from hostile references written centuries later. Imagine trying to understand Greek philosophy if Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates survived only as rumors mentioned by enemies. That is the scale of loss we are dealing with. And here is the most painful truth. We don't even know what questions these scholars were asking. History is not just answers, it is questions. Once the questions disappear, humanity loses entire directions of thought it might have explored. Technologies that might have emerged centuries earlier were delayed. Ethical frameworks that could have shaped governance vanished. Scientific observations were forced to restart from zero. Even when later dynasties attempted to recover what was lost, they were rebuilding from fragments. Confucian texts that survive today are reconstructed versions, filtered through later political needs. They are echoes, not originals. Shadows, not substance. This loss created a permanent distortion in history. When something disappears completely, future generations assume it never existed. The Qin did not just destroy texts. They reshaped reality itself by defining what future generations would believe was possible. And perhaps the cruelest part is this. The people who ordered the destruction never lived long enough to benefit from it. Qin Shi Huang died believing he had secured eternity. Instead, he created a vacuum that haunted China for centuries. Knowledge had to be rediscovered, reimagined, relearned. Humanity paid the price in lost time, something no empire can ever return. Angpiasti, their borders fade, their flags rot into dust. But ideas are harder to kill. And some ideas, especially the dangerous ones, outlive their creators. The Qin Empire collapsed, but its most terrifying concept survived. Control memory and you control the future. This idea did not vanish with the dynasty. It was absorbed, refined, and quietly reused by later rulers. Not always openly, not always violently, sometimes through education, sometimes through law, sometimes through silence. History, after all, is written not only by victors but by survivors who are allowed to speak. The Qin proved something that modern states understand deeply, that censorship does not always require fire. It can operate through selective preservation. Teach some stories, erase others. Celebrate certain figures, ignore the rest. Frame the past in ways that justify the present. This is why the Qin dynasty still matters. Not because it lasted, but because it demonstrated a formula where stability is valued over truth, where unity is prioritized over debate, where memory is treated as a threat. Look closely at the modern world, and the pattern becomes uncomfortable. Textbooks revised, historical figures simplified or sanitized, complex events reduced to slogans. Entire narratives pushed to the margins because they are inconvenient. The Qin Empire did this brutally. Modern societies often do it politely, but the effect is the same. The tragedy is not just what was lost in ancient China. The tragedy is that humanity keeps repeating the same experiment, believing it will somehow end differently. That suppressing the past will protect the future. That ignorance can create harmony. It never does. Because suppressed memory does not disappear. It mutates. It returns as resentment, rebellion, confusion, or collapse. The Qin learned this lesson too late. Fear can build an empire, but it cannot sustain one. And this brings us to the final truth. The most powerful empires are not those with the largest armies or the strongest walls. They are the ones that allow memory to exist freely, even when it is uncomfortable. Because memory creates resilience, debate creates adaptation, and truth, while dangerous, is the only thing that survives time intact. The Qin Empire tried to outsmart history. History outlived it, And that is why, more than 2,000 years later, we are still talking about an empire that chose to disappear. Not because it was strong, but because it was afraid. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. See you in next video. Stay blessed.